Thank you, Ruth, and thank you all for coming this afternoon. It was a long time ago when I wrote this book, 1985 it came out, and I was just trying to do the maths how many years ago, and it just got too much, so I blocked it. But the book that's on the table at the back, I think is the 4th edition of this. So I'm quite proud of it, actually, because it really was a very, very important part of my life in my career as well. But it became a bit all enveloping, the Ruskin Gallery. I just wanted to ask, how many of you actually went to the Ruskin Gallery when it was on Norfolk Street? Ah, right. So quite a lot of you. I'm not actually going to go through and really talk about what this book is, what's in this book. I'm going to really concentrate a bit more on the Ruskin Gallery and what I remember about it and what was important to Sheffield, but also slightly wider afield, I think. So the first, oh, that's not good, is it? Oh. Oh dear. This is not a good start. All right, well, while you're sorting that out. Ruth mentioned that I've spent most of my life working in public museums and galleries, but the Ruskin Gallery was very much, thank you, the first museum that I was allowed to sort of determine what happened. In the 1980s, you'll remember that there was the Mappin Art Gallery and the Weston Park Museum and the Graves Art Gallery. So the Ruskin Gallery, when it reopened in Sheffield in 1985, was very much a new addition to the whole sort of family of galleries and museums in the city. It actually started when I was back in 1981, when the collection came back to Sheffield. And it had been for a long time, since the 50s, in Reading University. And you may well ask why this happened. But the history of the collection of the Guild of St George is really rather an interesting one. And the first photograph I'm showing you is the earliest photograph we have of what the displays in St George's Museum looked like. And you can see that it was a very, very domestic environment. The museum was actually started was opened by design by John Ruskin, who had visited Sheffield. He visited about 4 or 5 times during his lifetime. There are some stories about him coming to live here or staying over, but none of that was really true. He came to Sheffield because it had been drawn to his attention while he was teaching at the Working Men's College in London by a man called Henry Swan. And Henry Swan was quite a radical thinker in himself, was very interested in education of the working men, and he was very keen to follow in Ruskin's footsteps in a way and try and enable Ruskin to fulfill some of the ideas that he'd been publishing in the letters to the working men of England. Henry Swan was a very talented man, a very individual guy who had been trained as an engraver on metal, but he was also a keen photographer, and he was one of the first to popularise riding bicycles. So you can see he was quite a radical chap. He came to Sheffield because he was in search of work, and he worked in the cutlery trade, engraving on metal. And he invited Ruskin to Sheffield and said, all your talk in his letters to the working men of England, why don't you put your museum that he'd been talking about to help educate working men of England in Sheffield? It's an ideal place, and I will be here to help. And Henry Swan, found the small museum in Walkley. It was on Bole Hill Road, I think now it's actually on Belhag Road because the roads have changed. But it was a very small cottage, a 4-room cottage, and of which this room is one of them. Ruskin came up to look at the property, decided to buy it, and Henry Swan and his wife were the curators. They lived there, they had children, and they curated the exhibitions and the displays. And you can see that it was slightly ad hoc. You know, they obviously, not many people could go there at any one time, but it became very much a focus point for the people who were of a radical mind in terms of education for the masses, if you like. But Ruskin really wanted to, his collection really was very much about introducing people to the things that had been very important to his own education. He was very much the son of a wealthy sherry merchant, and most of you will have heard of Domecq sherry, I'm sure. And in Ruskin's days, it was Domecq, I knew I'd forget this, it'll come back. He was part of, Ruskin, Domecq and Telford, that was the company. And they were very, very well off as a family. So Ruskin's education was very much geared to his own interests. He had private tutors. And a lot of it was about travel. It was about seeing things in this country, but also travelling abroad, mainly in Europe, France, Switzerland, Italy. And he was sure that what was very important was that people would see the best of the art and architecture and the natural world that he had experienced. And the museum was one way of him bringing to a much wider audience, to people who could never ever have travelled the way he had, who wouldn't have been able to afford the books, who wouldn't have been able to see the paintings that he'd seen, many of which were in private houses at that time. And so he was very keen that these would be introduced to them. And he did it in a very particular way, in that he commissioned artists to copy paintings that he admired. He'd send them off and they would copy them in Italy, Venice, Rouen Cathedral, the stained glass, the architecture, the landscape that he saw. He was very keen that people would have access to that. It was all about access, really. So he built up these collections. He paid artists to go off, and for years, you know, he would direct them what they should paint, not only go and paint that building, but go and paint the right-hand corner of this particular window or that particular carving. His knowledge was phenomenal. He could do this because he'd learnt himself about architecture and paintings, because he had copied the drawings and the paintings himself. He was a copyist in his own right, and he'd drawn the landscapes that he admired and thought wonderful. And so he collected all this stuff that he deposited in Sheffield. And his idea was that you just could replicate this endlessly, really, because you'd get more artists to copy more paintings, to buy more books, to buy more prints, to collect more minerals, bird prints, botanical studies. You just acquire it as he could because he had the money. And then you could seed all these different museums across the land. Well, in fact, in the end, the St. George's collection remained entirely a unique institution, but a very important one. Now, if you start looking at what was happening in Sheffield at that time in terms of museums, this museum opened about 1875, and the Weston Park Museum opened in 1876. So they were running sort of concurrently, and in fact the council here said to Ruskin, would you not put the Ruskin collection in our brand new Weston Park Museum? And he said no, absolutely not, because he thought it was full of really ugly things. He didn't like the stuffed animals, and he didn't like a lot of the flamboyant design of the exhibition pieces of the metalwork that were being displayed. So he was very particular about what he wanted to set up, and it wasn't in the normal mode of a museum that what people were thinking a museum was in the late 19th century. It was a much more individual, I think it's much more like a gentleman's library, if you like, you know, the private libraries and collections that lots of well-off people would accrue over through their own particular interests. You know, the philosophical societies and that were really important during the 19th century. It was much more in that sort of mode. So the slightly chaotic nature of this is a good sign, I think, of the intentions, the good intentions of Ruskin's collecting. I do this. Oh, what have I done again? What's happening? No, shall I do it on this then? I'll put that away. Out of reach. Okay, so what do I do?
It's just space.
Just space. Yeah. That one?
Yeah.
Okay.
Maybe we should sit.
Stay nearby. So, St George's Museum survived in Walkley for, 15 years. Henry Swan was a really interesting fellow, but he unfortunately died around 1889. And Ruskin at that time was suffering some really bad ill health problems and mental health problems. So the Guild, the directors of the Guild sort of took over in terms of what was going to happen with Walkley. You have to remember that Ruskin was a really important figure in the intellectual life of this country and further afield. He was really a huge name. So the Sheffield Council were very, very keen that they supported the museum. By that time, in 1884, the Mappin Art Gallery had been built, so we now had a museum, but we also had a very good Victorian painting gallery, purpose-built, very lovely. So the Ruskin collection, again, was playing a part in that whole family of museums in the city. So when the council acquired Meersbrook House, which had been a private house, they were wondering what to do with it, and of course they suggested in 1890 that the collection move to Meersbrook Hall, and it became the Ruskin Museum. And what had happened in those 15 years was that what was called the South Kensington system of museums, which we now know as the V&A and the Science Museum, the Natural History Museum, had really taken over the world of museums, and everything was about specialising and dividing our knowledge and the objects into separate families. So what happened in the Meersbrook, also because they had space, was that they divided the collection up. And so here we have the picture gallery, but there was also a sculpture gallery and a mineral gallery and a print room and a Carpaccio room, which ironically I think is now the toilets actually in Meersbrook House, when we did a bit of research over where everything originally had been. And so what happened there was that they employed a proper curator who was trained, who was one of the founders of the Museum Association, which still goes on today, which is the professional body. And it moved into an entirely different modus operandi. And the idea was that they sort of sorted Ruskin out. Of course, you never can sort Ruskin out. So in a way, a lot of those really important connections that were sort of imbued in Ruskin were broken, and people studied the collections, but they didn't realise that they could look at marbles that had been taken from, or say the same as the marble on St Mark's in Venice. You know, that those connections that were all important for Ruskin were fragmented. And it carried on much the same, I think, really until the 50s, when the Ruskin Museum finally closed. And then there's a sort of dark period in the history of the collection, because it was taken up by Reading University. And you may well ask, why Reading University? But because the collection has always been owned by the Guild of St George, the master of the Guild at that time had connections with Reading University, and he saw a resource that could help with research and, I suppose, do good for his particular faculty. So off it went in its boxes. And some of you will remember that in the Graves Art Gallery, there was one corner gallery that had the Verrocchio painting, and it had green velvet curtains round it. Does anybody remember that? One nodding head, yes. Well, I remember that because that was my introduction when I started as a research assistant at the Graves in the 70s. That was my introduction to Ruskin. And interestingly, I mean, I had studied English at university, and Ruskin was never mentioned. I mean, and I think to this day, Ruskin is not really studied at all until you get to sort of MA or PhD level. So it was all rather interesting, and there were a few choice items from the collection that was maintained by Sheffield, and the rest of it went off in crates to languish, actually, in various rooms and cellars in Reading University. All the grand plans just didn't happen for a gallery or for a research centre. So, comes back to me. In 1981, I'd been at the gallery for about 4 years, and someone had to check all this stuff back in, because it had been decided by the Guild that the collection would come back home to Sheffield, to its rightful place. And this was made possible by my boss, called Julian Spalding, who was a very energetic curator of the mapping, actually. And he had become a member of the Guild of St George. And he said, he suddenly realised that there was this whole collection that really should have been in Sheffield was down in Reading. So he arranged for it to come back with the hope that it would be an extension to the mapping would be its new home. It was supported by Frank Constantine, who was the director of the Guild of director of the Sheffield Art Galleries for many years, since the 60s. And he was also a director of the Guild of St George. So between them, they made it happen. So in 1981, all these crates came back. And actually, one of the people I worked with, he said, do you know, I don't think these have been opened. They'd actually, he said, I remember packing them up and sending them off. And some of them, so we opened them again, and I had the job of checking it all back in. And it's an enormous collection. You know, I don't know, 7,000 bird prints, you know, 2,000 minerals, lots of coins, lots of books and other prints and paintings and about 1,000 drawings and watercolours. I mean, it's a big, big collection. So for me, it was a fantastic experience. I just learnt really on the run, because you know, it was all new. It was all new really to most people. So that was really my role in it. And then, of course, the Mapping Art Gallery extension, which was basically a sort of square box, was thrown out by the planning department. And we all then sort of thought, oh, what shall we do? But we did have, as an arts department by then, we actually had Hayes Building. So let's hope this works. Oh, yes, this was the Sculpture Gallery at Meersbrook. So this Hay and Son, lovely building, still there, obviously. It used to be a wine merchant's, but it also, after it stopped being a wine merchant, it became our sort of technical department where the framing happened, and some lots of educational work happened on the top floor, you know, life drawing and drawing classes, painting classes. So in the end, the gallery was opened in this building. I've just put that in because what's interesting about Norfolk Street is it's a really old street, and the sort of the way the road, the pattern of roads was completely disrupted by all the building around the Peace Gardens. It used to actually, Norfolk Street used to just go right along the parallel to the moor and then right down and past Arundel Gate. Arundel Gate sort of cut through all the original patterning, and so it's quite interesting to see what was there before it was all demolished. So it reopened the gallery in 1985, and so this was the project that really I was working on from 81 right through to 94 when I left. It was a lovely building to work in. We had to rethink the whole business about how we were going to put forward and explain this collection that was extremely diverse and was unlike any other museum collection really in this country. And we had lots and lots of discussions about what should it be called. Now, you could say what's in a name. Well, actually, what's in a name is really quite a lot, because you could see the movement of the thinking of how to use this collection through from St George's Museum, through to the Ruskin Museum, through to the Ruskin Gallery. And the thinking behind that was obviously with Ruskin, it was a sort of a revolutionary act to create the St George's Museum, the patron saint of both England and Venice, which was important to him. The idea that St George was fighting the dragon, that Ruskin was very aware of the increasing industrialisation that was happening in the country, especially also in Sheffield, very obviously in Sheffield, about the pollution, the filth, the misery of a lot of the working conditions, but the inherent skill that was within the metal workers who were working in this city, and how St George would come and liberate them from the dragon. So there was a lot of feeling around the name, a lot of meaning around the name. And when it moved to Meersbrook, calling it the Ruskin Museum, even though Ruskin had still got 10 years to live, 10 years that weren't very, very active at all, they obviously were almost idolising Mr. Ruskin. You know, his name was the important one, not the action and the importance of the collection itself and what it should be doing. So we were in the dilemma of what do we call it? And we called it the Ruskin Gallery because we obviously wanted to say it was Ruskin because that was the attractor to audiences. But by calling it a gallery, we sort of reintroduced the importance of art and the creative nature of the collection and what we were trying to sort of demonstrate and show people. So that was the reasoning behind the change of the name. And I just put this up because it's a terrible photo, really. It's not survived very well, but these people really were the team. So there's me in front, holding a big blank piece of paper, which actually was a certificate saying that we'd won an award. And the Cheryl, who was my sort of PA, though we didn't call her a PA at that time, and then Gordon and Graham, who I have to say were fantastic people because they were such skilled people, both being able to make things, and a lot of the infrastructure of the building, of the displays were down to Gordon because he just could make things. And Graham was entirely wonderful with the people who came to see us. So that's just in honour of them. And also at the back, you can see these grills, these iron grills. Part of the thinking behind the Ruskin Gallery was that we were going to integrate works of art, works by contemporary artists, into the fabric, because we felt that that was an active acceptance and demonstration of Ruskin's hopes for the collection. An important part of the design of the gallery, as you can see, lovely high ceilings, but relatively small, was the notion of the library, of somewhere that people could come and look and enjoy some of the books. So we were trying to encourage people to engage with the collection physically, and we had quite a lot of people who took advantage of that. We felt that that sort of active inheritance of Ruskin's ideas was really important to sort of keep hold of. And you can see some of the plaster casts on the wall. All of those had to be restored and re-displayed. But what was ironic about that was that these plaster casts, a lot of them came from St. Mark's in Venice. And over the years since they'd been done, they were commissioned by Ruskin specifically for the museum, that the pollution that was happening in Venice had been eating away at the carvings. So, ironically, these carvings are more true to what the originals were than they are what you see today, which have continued to sort of erode. So there were lots of sort of interesting ideas just in the displays and the objects themselves. The display, we thought about very carefully about how we were going to do the display, because it was such a large collection, how we would almost sort of change it on a regular basis. And we decided that the upstairs mezzanine area, which was, you can see a bit better there, quite a small area, but nevertheless it gave us the opportunity to circulate the displays, the collections, with more coherent ways of explaining the collection to people. And Ruskin was most careful about how he thought museums should operate, and he said you can no more see 20 things properly in a day than you can read 20 books in a week. You've got to display them carefully and explain them thoroughly. And I sort of took that on board. I thought, okay, we've got to keep this gallery alive. We've got to keep changing it. It can't become a museum in that it becomes something within history. It's got to be something that talks to us now. So a whole series of displays, which I'll talk a bit more about, were around taking groups of objects and talking about them in a particular way, so people didn't get overcrowded. But over a period of time, you would be able to examine the collection if you came sort of on a regular basis. So that was the idea behind doing the changing exhibitions. And you can see there, I think that was on angels, actually. I think that was the theme. So that carried on for the first couple of years, 85 to 87. But we were very busy as well with creating the Ruskin Craft Gallery. Now, at that time, craft was having a bit of a resurgence. We're sort of used to it now, but there were very few craft galleries in the country. there were quite a number of established craft shops, but there weren't the sort of craft galleries that you have now. And we were sort of one of the first really to do that. And we did it obviously because it brought the Ruskin ideas up to date. It also filled a gap within the family of museums in the city. And it also reflected the tradition of craftsmanship inherent in the success of the city as well. We were pleased with this. It was a tiny space. In fact, the architect always called it the garage conversion. And in fact, that's what it was. But it was quite an elegant space, and it finished off that corner rather beautifully. The pictures I've got, I haven't really got very many pictures of what happened there. And this is Christmas crackers, which was a very novel idea that you could buy things from a gallery. Again, it's quite normal these days, but at that time we had long debates about whether it was ethical to let people buy anything that was on a wall of a public gallery. And you can imagine, you know, socialist Sheffield, and they didn't like the idea of us selling anything. And income generation was, we never talked about income. We never talked about money. I remember Frank Constantine saying to me, I was doing a little show in the Graves when I was first started, and I said, Frank, is it possible to have a leaflet printed? And he said, I said, have we got enough money? And he said, don't you worry yourself about that. It was never said to me ever again, I have to say. But the idea of selling work was really quite revolutionary. And it was a big success, and it continues today under a different name. But the Christmas show that the Millennium have here all comes back really from the 80s when we opened the craft gallery. Nice little shows. We did lots and lots of them, and I'll show you a few things. Very, very nice. So, I want to sort of just talk a little bit about the collection and about how we demonstrated the collection to the public, to the audience. This was one of my favourite shows, I have to say. And it sort of demonstrates very well about how you could use a collection that actually is quite inaccessible to people, to lots of people. The Dance of Death is a publication by Hans Holbein, famous, very famous. But the one that's in the collection is about this big, it's tiny. So how do you make that available to people in a sort of interesting way? And what we did was we literally photographed the pages, and then we photocopied them. No, we didn't photocopy them. We enlarged them. They were about this big, so you could actually see. And then we created a little leaflet with them all displayed. So it was a way of democratizing the book. Now, those prints were meant to be pushed around the world. They weren't originally, they weren't sort of precious items. They were supposed to be a bit like newspapers, if you like, you know, as going around society. And it was one way of sort of reflecting the original idea of the prints and making them much more available to everyone. And it really was a big success. And you'll notice that the Dance of Death, I mean, that was a calligrapher who we worked with, Brian Walker, who did a lot of work for us, and we tried to introduce the idea of the handwritten, but contemporary, again into the sort of the design of the whole of the exhibition. So that was sort of one idea that we had, and it sort of demonstrates that the idea of making it available. That was my obsession. How do we bring this collection out to as many people as we can in a meaningful way? The calligraphy was very interesting because you could then connect between the activity of the Craft Gallery and the Ruskin Gallery and start to make those contemporary historic connections as well. And Brian did classes for a long time in the Ruskin on a Saturday and introduced a lot of people to calligraphy and was, you know, it sort of gave back. At a time when lots and lots of those classes were being closed, if you remember that, you know, we all used to go to evening classes and actually they all sort of died a death in the 80s and 90s. And it was a way of introducing people to something new. Similarly, we were very interested in the the ornithological prints, which the collection has about 7,000, and you can see some of them in the display in the gallery down the road. Silent Wings was a way of bringing up the idea of extinction. I mean, there's nothing new in this world, really. We were very interested in looking at the body of prints that we had in the collection and then finding out which birds had actually become extinct over the period of time since they were drawn, which was probably about mid-1830s, 40s, through to the present day. And I don't know if you remember a book on the crow family. It was a few years ago by Mark Cocker. You hear him occasionally on the radio. Well, his wife was my assistant at that time, so he worked on this project with us. And it was just fascinating that you could use a collection like the Gills collection, but you could turn it to something that was really very, very contemporary and an issue of the day. So trying to use it in a creative way. Decorative papers. I mean, we found a lady who had a fantastic collection of paper, decorative papers and lots of other things. And we were able to show her collection as a special exhibition. The thing about the Ruskin was that it was small enough to be very fleet of foot. It was, we were able to introduce collections from other people who we thought resonated with the collection. William Morris, you know, how could we not do something on William Morris? The library has a huge collection, not a huge, a good collection of Kelmscott Press, and we were able to borrow more books. So again, that was a way of energising it. Botanical illustration, the same. We also organised lots and lots of classes on botanical illustration, and the university, I think it happens in the, it's a former part of the university, I think now actually, or it used to be anyway. So again, it was a way of introducing people to other things. J.M.W. Turner, we have a large collection of the Liber Studiorum prints. Ruskin was a great fan. His father introduced his son to J.M.W. Turner, who was a family friend, and his father bought paintings from Turner. And of course, Ruskin, when Turner died, he was responsible for dealing with the estate that is now in the Tate. So, very close connections with Turner. And then we were very keen about having people who were active artists at the time and introducing them. And David Walker Barker, he was a local Sheffield artist who painted these really remarkable landscapes. And so it was a pleasure to be able to show his work as well. So it was going between the historic and the contemporary. Now, Elizabeth Siddall, this was an interesting one. She was the girlfriend of Rossetti. I can't remember where they got married, actually. They did, yeah. And Elizabeth Siddall actually lived in Sheffield, and no one had really done an exhibition of her work. And I was talking to a lady called Jan Marsh, who is an academic who had studied, wrote a biography about Elizabeth Siddall. So it was these sorts of projects that we could start to expand the Ruskin Gallery out into outside the city. We were trying to establish ourselves really as an important gallery, an important collection in the wider world. She was one of our first sort of forays into that. Elizabeth Siddall was born in London, but she came with her family up to here, obviously her father for work purposes. She was a very keen artist, amateur artist, and she was, we sort of looked very, it was an interesting look at her origins in Sheffield and how she'd started to become an artist, and then obviously when she met the PRB. So again, that was the first little entree into doing something that was a bit more nationally important. So, Craft Gallery, I'm going to sort of whiz through these quite quickly, but the basket makers, we had a wonderful exhibition of basket making, and we did a lot of classes of making cardboard baskets, and again, that was a way of looking at how we could put into Ruskin's sort of thinking that we should start looking carefully, we should make things. Making was really very important to the reasons why he gave the collection to Sheffield. Threads of silk, again, we sort of went through all the materials. Papier-mâché, glassworks, contemporary tapestry. So it was a very active gallery in that we tried to have contemporary makers, some of whom it was the first time they'd exhibited, actually start to develop their own careers and their own brands, if you like, though we didn't talk about brands in those days. But Sheffield makers were really important as well, and we wanted to focus on them. About once a year we focused on Sheffield makers, and I remember talking to a jeweller, and she said, not a couple of years ago, and she said, you were the first to exhibit my work. And I had no idea, because I mean, her work was interesting, but it was that sort of foothold into a new world for them. People like John Leach, who was part of the Bernard Leach, who's the great-grandson, I think. We exhibited him. This was part of a series of exhibitions that really featured craftspeople who had been given a crafts council bursary, which was financed by the Guild of St George. So eventually we started to sort of pull the Guild back into the life of the Ruskin Craft Gallery. For about 10 years, the Guild offered, I think it was about a couple of £1,000 to a craftsperson, and John Leach was one of them, to help them set up a business. And it was very successful. The Crafts Council supported it as well, splitting, giving a similar amount to it. And after about 10 years, the Crafts Council backed off and said they didn't want to do it. But we were left with this sort of legacy of 10 or so craftspeople, some of whom are really the big names in the country. They all started off with this, with the helping hand of the Guild. Janice Chilenko, who got very well known for her pieces in Next. If you remember when Next did sort of interior decor, she was their person who designed their ceramics. She was, we gave her a retrospective. She was one of the people. And so that was very nice to sort of help people along in their mid-career as well. So we come to Ruskin and Tuscany, which was sort of the big exhibition that we organised. Ruskin had been he'd worked very, very hard and long in Siena, and Pisa and Lucca. And we were very keen that we looked at that body of work that he'd produced over the years. And this exhibition was shown in London first, the Accademia Italiana, and then it came to Sheffield, and then it went to Lucca. And it was a way of sort of taking back to Italy some of the works that he had he'd drawn himself, and also some of the attendant work that other artists had. And that was a very important academic, it's a big academic catalogue, which again helped to encourage more Ruskin studies. And then this, the cutting edge, this sort of brings us right back to the beginning of why Ruskin gave the collection to Sheffield, because of his admiration of the skills of the tool makers in this country, in this city. The story is quite an interesting one, how this came to be, and it's a very Sheffield story. Gordon, who I showed a photo of, was a very keen handyman, and he used to go to buy his tools from Ken Hawley's, that was a shop just off the moor. He closed about 20, 30 years ago. And he introduced me to Ken one day, because I was, I think we just bought our flat, and we were doing a bit of DIY, and he said, "Oh, you need tools, and I'll take you to Ken, and he'll sort you out." So I met Ken Hawley, and he was telling me about his lifelong interest in the Sheffield trade, tool trade. And at that time, we're looking at the 88, 89, there were an awful lot of these small tool companies going out of business. You know, the little Mesters that were scattered all throughout the city. And Ken Hawley, sort of single-handedly, although he had a couple of mates who helped him, he would approach people who he knew had heard on the grapevine that they were going bust, or they were selling up, or they were retiring. And he would go and he would claim back the archives and the tools themselves, and sometimes the equipment that they made them with. And he stored them in various sheds in his backyard, and sometimes the dining room, which his wife really, really objected to. And the collection is absolutely phenomenal. And what I've always seen throughout my life is when people like me, a curator, a museum curator, turns up, you know it's over. We have an unerring ability just to arrive, just almost too late, but not quite. And I was saying, "What are you going to do with all this collection, Ken?" And he said, "Well, I don't know." He said, "Who's going to take it on?" He'd fallen out with Kelham Island for various reasons. And I was saying, well, let's do an exhibition, because from my point of view, it was the perfect exhibition for the Ruskin Gallery. It spoke of Sheffield, it spoke of craftsmanship, skill, the metal traditions of the city, Ruskin's admiration, but also his desire to help, not educate, that sounds really a bit pompous, but to widen people's visual experience of the world through his collection. So in the end, me and another assistant came, and we selected these tools, having Ken as a guidance in terms, because we knew absolutely nothing about tools. And we treated them very much as sort of fine objects, which amused him quite a lot, because he had a very technical approach. But we said, no, it's all about what they look like and the beauty of them. And they were absolutely fantastic things. And we put this exhibition on. And the number of people who came through the door was astonishing, because we somehow tapped into all those men who had worked in the steel trade, some of the women as well. But just as it was dying, they could see their life's work sort of in a museum, I suppose, in a gallery, on public view, and being looked at as wonderful objects. And so that was a real high point. It also meant that the City Council suddenly woke up to the Ruskin Gallery, because they thought it had been, you know, for arty people and snobby people and, you know, people who not normal people. And suddenly there were all these men and these guys coming in and, you know, looking at things that meant a lot to them. So that was a real shift in the thinking of it. And so that sort of carried us on through quite difficult times, if you remember, during the beginning of the cuts, through the 90s. It was quite a difficult time, and it absolutely kept the gallery going. Now, I left in 94, the gallery, but I left the Sheffield in 99. And by that time, this place was being discussed, because it was the 2000, you know, the Millennium Gallery. And the discussion was around how could we afford it? How could we afford the cost of this building? And one of the ways was that we would sell the Hayes building, and this would, I think they got about £1 million, and that helped to build this place. And then the gallery, the collection moved into the in the Ruskin Gallery down the end. And the idea also at that time was to bring the metalworking as well. So ironically, in the end, it was, you know, the collection ended up next to the metalwork collection, which Ruskin had said, I really, you know, I think it's awful, full of rubbish, not rubbish, but, you know, ugly things. So it's quite ironic. I see the irony of that. But it also is interesting because the Ruskin and the metalwork really are the base bones of Sheffield culture. And having them sit next to each other actually does make sense. It makes sense historically. So I am always sort of interested about that whenever I come here. The issue over the moving of it is that it becomes, although it's still called the Ruskin Gallery, it's sort of changed its name again because it's obviously part of the Millennium Gallery. And I think that it's that sort of shift, as shown in the name and these different buildings that it's occupied, the buildings and the name almost allow a certain approach to be given to a collection and how you use it. And it's fascinating when you know a collection to see how it has developed and changed over the years and how different people have used it. So when you think about a collection, a museum collection, it's not a static thing. It's not a sealed thing. It's forever being reinterpreted and changing and being presented in different ways to the point where it becomes something else, it becomes something different. And when it's successful, it becomes something that means more to us than it had before. So I sort of see this collection as going on its way, on its life, and it will have many iterations in the future, I'm sure. And I think it's fascinating how people use it in different ways and see value in it in different ways. So I was just very glad to have the freedom at that time in the 80s and 90s to sort of do my bit, you know, and have that freedom to put on different exhibitions and to work with different people. And it continues to this day, but in a different guise, in a different way. I think that's it.